It's January 14th, Sunday, 2024. I want to pick up where I left off about the psychosexual evaluations and how it informs what's going on with the treatment program. So, in the treatment program, they apparently use what's in the psychosexual evaluation to determine the type and the scope and probably the length of that as well. So you can imagine my surprise where, as I read to you in yesterday's segment, they had gone through and determined that my risk level was pretty low. In fact, at the end of the report that Michael Coons did, that report indicates a psychosexual recidivism rate of 6.8%. Now, I think he gets this from the Department of Corrections, and I think the Office of Juvenile Justice Program Statistics, that the average recidivism rate is 6.8%, they say, for my type. Now, if you actually look at independent scientific studies done by people who don't have an axe to grind, you will find that the overall recidivism rate from the most violent offender to somebody like me who didn't actually intend to do anything but was nevertheless hit, and convicted, but at that lowest level, that's between 3.4 and 4.3%. That's the range that I've seen, and I've read probably 25 different studies, not only in the US, but also in Canada and also in Australia and a few other places, which makes you wonder when the Department of Corrections goes up for review. Interestingly, what they will do is they'll come up and they will say, we don't need any oversight panel because we've pushed the recidivism rate so low, it's just indicating that we're doing our job. Versus when they want money and resources, they will come back often in the same session and tell legislators, "Oh, this is very bad. It's out of control. We need lots of money to stem this tide." So, as I pointed out when I testified once, which lie do you want to believe? So, going back to Michael Kuhn, 6.8%, and he said I have a fairly low, moderate level of recidivism. So what they did is they took me in and they had me do two sessions, two types, over about a year-long span. The first type of treatment was fraught from the start. It was a problem from the start because they had me go in with a group of men in that same office in the Lake Ridge area. And in that office, they required me, among the very first things to do, I had to write a letter of apology to my victim. Well, in the sex stings that the police do, 95% of them roughly are called proactive stings. They sometimes call them, I'm told, traveler stings. Essentially, there's no victim. There's no real person who's under threat. The police are just hanging out and they're trolling, my word, not theirs, but that's what they're doing. And they're dangling a persona that they create. So they'll start out as an adult, as you've heard me say, and after maybe 100 messages, they'll say, I'm 15, and they'll change it up on you. And if you don't immediately desist, you're in trouble. That's the sort of thing that is a proactive thing. So how do I write a letter to a victim when there's no victim? So I fought that just on logic grounds, and they didn't know what to do with that. As my probation officer explained, she said, we've never had anybody like you who've actually fought the charges. That's pretty amazing. After many, many years, this particular jurisdiction didn't have one person that was going to fight the charges, not one. So that's pretty telling right there. So I fought that, and they eventually decided that this was not a good place for me to be. I remember giving feedback and being complimented for helping other people write their letters to stay on track and be on task, and to write effective letters that made sense. And they took advantage of my teacher training for that. I was complimented by the facilitator about that. But there was no place for me there. So they took me out of that. Their words, not mine. We're going to take you out of this. We're going to put you in something else. Okay. So they put me in the next one, And this was during COVID, by the way. So COVID had begun to hit, and we began to go for virtual sessions, but not before this happened. So they sent me to this office, and they told me to arrive 15 minutes early to do some paperwork. Fine. And then the session would begin immediately thereafter. This time it would be a group session with a bunch of men, similar to the other one. And they were going to discuss sex and sexuality and healthy understandings of sex. Okay, fine. And again, I was forced to do it. I was forced to pay for it. So they charged me $50 a term. And that's pretty steep when you don't have a job. And you don't have a job because they keep preventing you from doing that by arresting you or whatever the case may be. But the fact that you're a felon is very difficult to get a job. So I went and I filled out the paperwork, and I arrived 20 minutes early, give myself a little extra time. And by the time I finished the paperwork, I got into a position where I walked into the room that I was told to go to, and I sat down and greeted everybody briefly and then was ready to start. The facilitator, who was a young 20-something, she was maybe 22, 23, an intern, immediately looked at everybody and said, "Class, what do we tell people who are here late?" And these men of various ages, looking very uncomfortable, all in unison, like a kindergarten class, said, "If you arrive late, you have to leave. We inform your probation officer that you were late, and then you can come next time, and we hope you're not late, because being late interferes with our healing process." I couldn't believe what I heard. And I explained to the woman, I'm late because they had me do this paperwork, and it wasn't difficult paperwork, it just took time. And she said it didn't matter, I was still late. So I drove home, I called my attorney, I called my probation officer. Probation officer said not to worry about it, she'd look into it. But it just gives you an idea of how silly the place is. I arrived, I think, the next Tuesday or Wednesday, very early. And we were warned not to talk to anybody during the break down in the parking lot. They don't want other so-called offenders talking to one another. And so I had to sort of hang around by myself, waiting to come back into the room. And then we sat down, we went through the training, and I was appalled at the training because I was in the middle of the cycle. And that particular day, they were talking about sexual organs. And I kid you not, this reminded me of something that I had taught in health years ago. I was a substitute for somebody, a regular faculty, but they weren't there, and I was supposed to do the lesson. And the lesson had to do with penises and vaginas. And I kid you not, the lesson said, what is a penis? What is a vagina? What are the two functions of a penis? This was sex offender treatment. And if the general public understood what a colossal waste of time it is, I'm not a clinician, but I really don't know how this can help anybody. This is what I taught in a fifth grade health lesson 30 plus years ago. It amazed me. During COVID, we didn't meet as much. We met virtually. And during the virtual times, we were supposed to call in. We were supposed to give a report on how the week went, basically, whether we had learned anything, whether we had been behaving ourselves. And the end of the treatment program ended up with me being told I didn't need this particular program. I called Dr. Hardenberg, who was head of the program, and she agreed with me. We didn't need this. The reason I mention this is because sometime around 18 months later, after I was off probation, after they had tried to keep me on probation, after they had gone to the judge and asked for an additional year of probation because they wanted to do additional testing on me, what they ended up doing is doing something pretty nasty. Right before I got out of the program, my sister, with whom I was estranged, and I didn't tell any of my family about this. She apparently didn't call me, but she called. She found out who the probation officer was in my jurisdiction. She called the probation officer. She found out what the nature of my charges were, and then she went and got all the information she thought she needed. The probation officer and she had been calling and talking to one another back and forth. And then apparently she convinced my sister to file an order of protection so that I couldn't come to Wisconsin and see my mother, who was ailing in the hospital fighting dementia, because they reasoned I would somehow hurt my mother. This is how sick this system is. And it seemed to me every bit as retaliatory because I'd fought the program on grounds and on principles. They didn't get their way, and the judge threw out their case to try to get me additional probation. So this is the way to get back at me. And it's even worse than that. 18 months later, as I started to say, I got a position as head of prison education for the Virginia Community College system. What I would do is develop education programs for jails and prisons through the individual community colleges. The 23 colleges around the state, and the the position was contingent on my getting permission. They called it a credential, but it was permission from the Department of Corrections here in Virginia to go into those facilities. I wasn't allowed over and over again for months to get into I couldn't get an answer. It took 2 months just to find out who to talk to at DOC. And I was treated very badly when I went in there. So I had meetings planned. I went over to DOC. They would stand me up. The person in charge wasn't around. They would say they would take your picture and take your fingerprints and everything and apply for this permission between the hours of 9:30 and 11:30. But as a woman told me, even though it's 9:30 to 11:30, she really only got there around 11 o'clock. I mean, it was crazy. Finally, we got them done. And I waited and waited for 6 months. Toward the end of my tenure there, before they fired me 8 months into my term, I kept pressing, hey, I'm supposed to be going out to these facilities. This is what you had all told me you wanted. So why haven't I done that? I received word back that I was not going to be allowed. And the reason was because probation officer Rachel Taylor had written in my file I was uncooperative, I was difficult. They couldn't, I was thrown out of the programs, which was news to me. They had told me it just didn't suit me. I was thrown out of both treatment programs, and they had some other information they wouldn't tell me, but that it was in this file. The next thing I know, I was called by my boss, who told me that I was being fired over Zoom. They fired me over Zoom. And the reason for the firing was because I couldn't get this permission. But it seems rather suspicious that they suddenly were told all these untrue things about my supposed probation status. And one of those things was the discredited charge that I was attempting to solicit in a park, and which was apparently guaranteed by the word of these vigilantes, which the court had dismissed. My probation officer knew it was dismissed, but she still cited me anyway, and it was in the report, and it remained in the report, even though it was never updated. Nobody asked me for the documentation to prove it. They simply fired me. And this is how DOC gets back to you. This is why they're very vicious and why the entire system is more than a little bit corrupt. So that just gives you an idea of the treatment programs. Now, to be fair, I have heard from one or two people at a conference I went to in North Carolina a couple years ago, which brought people from all over the world. And a couple of people from North Carolina had said that they did benefit from a sex offender treatment program. It did help them understand that they had an addiction, etc. But they also had relations with somebody illicitly. and this had been a problem since their youth. And certainly there are people who can benefit from certain of these programs, but that doesn't make them any less predatory. From this reason, other people had told me that they had one clinician who would do this intake, this sex offender treatment. If they didn't do it by X date, they would be thrown into prison, and there would be no recourse. So there was one provider in North Carolina, and this provider charged $3,000 to do this. Another one, $5,000, they told me, these two guys. And they didn't have that kind of money. And one of them had to take out a loan, or I can't remember how he got it. His parents went scrambling everywhere among relatives. And the other one had to mortgage something, and then he lost it because he couldn't pay it back. And I think it was a motorcycle. I don't remember what it was, to be honest with you. But it's pretty steep when you can charge $3,000 to $5,000 for an evaluation that you know people have to have, or they'll go to prison. $3,000, $5,000 for a 5-hour evaluation, that's more than predatory. So it just gives you an idea of how the system really works and how it really preys on people's insecurities and their fears. Thank you for listening. This is ICAC Unpacked. I'm Norman Michaelation.